Hello and welcome. There is some stuff we have to talk about today, but before I get into the video proper, I just want to say that I apologize for making this video again for the fourth time. I tried to do some streaming with some PS4 gameplay, and it just didn't work out on streaming. YouTube was being weird. Kept losing server connections, kept having Wi-Fi issues, kept having streaming issues. And then when I did get the video up, it was just constantly skipping around on the audio, so I didn't really want to use that, so now I'm back to my actual site. In violent crimes against Asian Americans and Asian nationalities, at least in America. But what's really interesting is that if you go and look outside the United States to foreign media outlets, they actually classify this as a uptick or a surge in violence, whereas America kind of depicts this as a new phenomenon. And that really kind of bugged me because I've actually been keeping diaries and keeping tabs on the pandemic since it started, mainly for historical posterity, but also because it's just one of those things when something like this happens, notes are notes are basically what make the history. And I kind of noticed that people seem to forget that anti-Asian violence and hate crimes against Asian people have almost been perpetuating for a long time, since the start of the pandemic, but even before that, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in America, and our history, in fact, goes into that. So I decided to talk about the historical concepts that basically led to America.
Actually, Americans have always hated Asian people.
And we're going to start off, this is not a complete list, it's just a quick overview that I went through with some of my history books in my background, and so just some of the many textbooks that I referenced to. And we're going to start off in 1853, so we're going to dial the American clock back all the way to 1853, which is the first real demonstrated case of this. There was, of course, other cases earlier on, but those are mostly depicted to us in terms of journals and letters from captains or from ship colonels back home, and I don't consider them very reliant because those people were, in a lot of those letters, they're more apt to talk about you than the fact that they were actively bombarding Asian and Asiatic villages, so 1853 is where we're going to start historically. I'm also going to note that, yes, the French, Spanish, and English forces were, of course, extorting Asian people for a long time when the imperial game, long before the America as an established independence, 1776, came about. So I'm actually going to say that because America was doing trade with England, they did benefit from the extortion of the Asiatic trade, Silk Road, and stuff like that. There's, of course, that. I do want to note that out, but we'll be getting more into that into the cultural aspect. Let's just go with dates for right now. Japan is visited by America through their gunboat policy, and essentially are forced, literally at the point of a gun, to give America exclusive trading rights and Pacific Island negotiations. Now, how this kind of works is Japan had just come out of, it didn't just, 300 years earlier in the 1200s, 1300s, it had started its essentially Warring States period, and in about 1530s, 1540s, the Warring States period had essentially basically given this moment where Japan had taken its jaws on culture and everything about life, clamped them down on the post-Edo period, and said, this is how we're going to do life. And for 300 confluences to advanced technologies. They did do some sparse trading with the Dutch under the strict regulation with the Dutch, because the Dutch actually worked through Korea, and with China, the Dutch couldn't actually touch down on the main island. They actually had a separate island that the Japanese would do trade with, or extremely censored people under sanction from the government would actually meet the Dutch ship to ship and do their trading and then come back. And it was very much on a catalog basis. And he was allowed to leave Japan. Nobody. You couldn't get in, you couldn't get out. And if you did, you were shot, you were killed, whatever. The higher ruling elites of Japan did know about a world outside, but your average Joe on the street, merchant class, peasantry class, even some samurai probably wouldn't know much about the world besides Korea, China, and maybe a little bit of the South Pacific Isles. The ideas of Europe were basically just written out of history. They were very much locked into keeping this culture and this time for as long as possible. And then America literally rolls up on them with gunboats, which in 1853, a gunboat was essentially a heavy cargo ship, or a 7 to 5 masted ship, what's known as a bulk hauler. But instead of hauling massive amounts of grain for commercial and industrial sales, it's literally loaded with guns. We're talking 3 and 4 rows of cannons, each row about 12 to 20 guns long, and there was a small armada of these things. This is literally the proto-dreadnought. The term packed to the gunnels load these ships so much with ammunition they would be barely above the water, and if they fired them all, they would raise about 12 feet in the air because of how much weight they distributed. These were incredibly devastating boats. So literally, at a point of a gun, America told Japan, you're going to adopt to us. Now, a lot of people understand this period from the movie The Last Samurai. Complex and really dumbs down how Americans saw the Japanese. Part of the actual trade agreements that the Americans have with the Japanese, that they literally forced the Japanese to sign at the threat of invasion from what would be the Marines, was that Japan could not own or produce or purchase any goods that would be known or given to European powers. What this basically means is that if you wanted a cup of Earl Grey tea or a cup of Bailey's Irish cream, you had to get it through a foreign country. And what this does, it basically gives America a sole avenue to huck their wares in Japan. Japan also, seeing how much they were behind and how much the world had advanced before then, rapidly tried to assimilate to American culture. That's the belief. Japanese saw how superior the white man was, and so they wanted to be like that. When in reality, Americans told them that since American culture would be required for their staying and housing in Japan for embassies and trade negotiations, it would be best if the Japanese adopted American culture. This is basically us telling them, you should dress and act like us because it would go a long way to us not just outright shooting you. Yeah. We don't have any off switches. I would like to apologize first. Now, this isn't to say that Japan didn't have its own specifically Americans impressing upon them. This also goes a long way with Japan rapidly changing its culture to fit this American Shirayama rebellion, which The Last Samurai is built on, but also several peasant uprisings. There was a ideology. This is essentially a country that's like North Korea, but for almost 500 years, as opposed to the 50 or so North Koreans have. There were some very deeply entrenched people. There was also some people that were openly fascinated by these new comers and were very interested to adopt a lot of those technologies. This led to a lot of civil slights, not only fights in bars, all the way up to full-fledged rebellions, that the Americans were eager to help put down. Not only with the manufacturing weapons and regimentation of American tactics to the Japanese people, but also with the actual usage of the Union Army. Certain Union members of the Union Army were actually sent to Japan to help put down rebellions and had to use their technology. This is actually where the Gatling gun gets really, really big, because the Japanese military still used regimented infantry techniques, since lining up with sticks and marching across open ground, which Americans, being based off of the British style of volley fire tactics, were really good at. It turns out that when you have guys with guns who can just sit in a trench and volley fire you as you march across open ground, works out pretty well for them. So yeah, and then a lot of these historical teachings, Americans also did not allow historians to record a lot of these. Now, the Shirayama Rebellion was very integral in the fact that we do have a lot of art and culture and stuff that documented it, but a lot of the more smaller peasant rebellions, they're not as regularly written about because a lot of those documentations were destroyed basically because it painted the Americans in a bad light. So moving from 1853 to the 1850s and 1860s, the Americans essentially start establishing pseudo-slavery. Now, what I'm going to establish as a term of pseudo-slavery is essentially the person is a slave in all intensive purposes, despite one or two things that might lead against slavery. What this is to say is that the person might be getting paid money for their labor, but the money is all but useless. Or the person might be receiving some form of compensation, or they have their autonomy, but they're still locked in with a very strict contract that essentially makes them a slave to the rebellion. Workers who had to work in factory towns were essentially pseudo-slaves. They were a slave in all but name. This is not to be confused with an indentured servant. An indentured servant is a totally different classification, and there's a huge rung between indentured servant and pseudo-slavery, and there's a huge rung between pseudo-slavery and actual slavery. But I'm just using this term right now. It will become important when we get into the 1860s. But as America immediately starts attacking the Japanese accept this. You see how effective the Americans are. They've always kind of been imperialistic in their lifespans, so now it's time to expand with these new military weapons. Now that we've subjugated the populace, it's time to reach out. America effectively uses the Japanese to commit to operations in areas of the world. There are raids into Manchuria, what would be now China. There are raids into Korea. This essentially is to help people see, hey, look, the Americans are helping the Japanese. You should be like the Japanese and assimilate with us. But we're using the Japanese to do all the dirty work so that when we sweep in, we kind of seem like we're not the puppet masters. And this perpetuates through the for a long time. And they had known about Korea, and they had known about China and the northern Asiatic areas. The reason why they went to them at that point in time was we had recently finished up with the Civil War. The Revolutionary War. We had recently finished up with a lot of imperialism being kicked out from the British, and we were very eager to make some money and make a lot of operational processions. So, of course, where did the British have? Well, the British know they have to go all the way through Asia to get to the Silk Road, and the Turks have locked that off, which means they have to use India and other ports. We can cut them off by using the West Coast to transmit stuff. This will go a long way to producing the American Railroad, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But basically, then 1861 happens, and that's, of course, the American Civil War, which was fought over slavery, and officially starts 2 weeks before Lincoln is inaugurated, when Jefferson Davis signs the Articles of Confederacy. In 1861, and you can read about this in the book Blue Gray Democracy, there was a lot of actual other countries looking at the American Civil War, because America was this new player, and it had a lot of land and it had a lot of operations people wanted. And they didn't have to fight the imperialism game if you already have another empire you can work with. And there was a lot of strategic advantage to having that, the eastern colonies. So, what do? Well, Abraham Lincoln asked a lot of other countries, France, England, Victorian England, of course, Russia, and even some Germanic mercenary groups to offer some support. Basically, Abraham Lincoln told these countries that he would ask them to adopt hostile neutrality in regards to the Civil War. This is basically asking people, we're not telling you can't fight. We're not telling you you can fight. What we're saying is, we would like you to go out of your way to not get involved. Essentially, this is saying, hi, I'm going to be kicking my brother's ass, because he basically, he really needs to get toned down. Would you literally anywhere else for the next 20 minutes? That's basically what that is. The South, however, had a different approach. There were a lot of these countries, Queen of England and Russia predominantly, were actually really, really eager to start moving in to kind of work with the Confederacy to get better access to cotton and tobacco production, because those are the big cash crops of the South. Not to mention mining resources and, of course, Florida, which had recently, the South had kicked all the Spanish out of Florida, and there was a lot of sugar, textiles, and rums. So, of course, the British were very interested in getting in with the South. Unfortunately, the South, being about as, nuanced as a rusty chainsaw in a surgery ward, went, you guys are not only going to help us win this war against them damn Yankees, but y'all are also going to be giving us a discount on all the munitions we have. We're going to need you to supply us at a discount, and we'll train it back in an IOU. We'll pay you back after the war's over. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to cut off cotton production to you until you sign the agreement. This is literally the worst way to do business. Well, you will help me, and until you agree to help me, sold. And she basically said, I'm not going to help the Confederacy. Or if I do, it'll be like in trade, it will literally be in mercantile only. Russia, which had recently joined the imperialism game, really needed cotton for its uniforms. But Russia also was to the point of, let's play both sides of this angle and see which one wins if the North is going to win. And when the South started winning a lot in the early stages of the war, Russia got a lot cozier with giving the South aid. And then the South started consistently losing. And of course, Russia switched sides to give the North aid. So Russia was a little more tactical about it. But the big thing about this is that Russia, which Russia is an Asiatic people. Don't argue with me on that. But what happened was that because of the short supply of cotton and to these areas, England still needed those supplies. So did France. So did Russia. So what happened? Well, Russia's big enough where they could still get those supplies elsewhere, and there was some small terraforming operations into what would be the Kazakh lands, modern-day Kazakhstan, to grow cotton. It just wasn't as effective as it was in the South because they had slavery and a different industry, but it was effective. England, on the other hand, decided to switch to wool and hemp uniforms, but of course, where to get wool and hemp? Well, at the time, it came from India. So, to make up the difference of the loss of cotton and those supplies, England turned over to India and more manufacturing to make up the difference. And yes, a lot of people keep forgetting that India is in Asia. There's a lot of people that forget that for some reason. When we think Asian, we only think like East Asian. We don't actually consider the Middle East and Indian people and South Pacific and Russians. And Mongolians and Nepalese. So when that starts happening, the farmers that are already pretty pushed to the brink to satisfy England and Queen Victoria's ravenous hunger during their imperialism age are even getting more power roped on them. And these are not the people who are doing it. These are serfs and agricultural workers that are trying to keep up with the factories in England to continue the cycle. So a lot of America having a civil war actually has impacts all the way to Asia, where there are people literally, selling out entire plots of land to try and manufacture more goods, and tariffs being heavily pushed, and taxes going up. And basically, because England wasn't getting their goods on one end, they had to burn the candle twice as hard on the other end. And this would actually go to causing a lot of famines in Asia. So this really ramps up. Now, once the South is complete and the war is over, this system, of course, there's the reconstruction area. This problem still persists. England, getting the amount of supplies they were, now got to pull from America as well, but they never loosened the demands on India. This actually led to a lot of uprisings in India because people were getting sick and tired of being pushed so hard by the British and the mercantile business. And this was not the British Crown, incest between the East India Company and the British Crown and the British government. We might as well just consider them the same thing. So basically, when the stores and supplies opened back up, England didn't relent. England kept these manufacturing dates up just because they just didn't care. And I'm going to count that as America helping the exploitation of Asia. 1860s to 1890s. Because a lot of these famines from the American Civil War, and along with other cultural and agricultural issues into China, along with the imperialism game with Japan, there's essentially a big problem that hits China. They have a long series of droughts and poor weather conditions. They have a lot of famines. The soil stops giving. And basically a small inter-civil war breaks out into the mainland. This has caused lots of people to essentially starve and die, and for cannibalism to literally crop up in some of the provinces. Of course, on the other side of the pond, that is to say the Pacific, of all Asian people, and that would be America. This is the start of what is known as the Great Chinese, well, it's not the actual term is very racist in my opinion, but we're going to call it the Great Chinese Immigration, or the Mass Chinese Immigration, where lots of Chinese people, to escape the plagues, helps out is that it prevents the Japanese from basically attacking Chinese shipping lanes because America is now benefiting from them too. It doesn't slow down Japanese imperialism of the South Pacific and the Pacific Isles. In fact, actually, a lot of the times the Japanese are the ones that are perpetuating the militarism protections of these trade routes and actually extorting the Chinese companies that send people over. But let's talk about the Chinese people specifically with the railroads. So the Chinese people, and I do believe it was the Han Province, essentially were having a bunch of uprisings because they basically couldn't get food. People were starving and dying. Cannibalism was documented quite often because people they had nothing to eat. Pretty much all the grains that they could make were sold to try and make up their businesses. These people literally were starving and dying. And so what they did is they would sign up with a company who would send them over to America, that company being funded by American railroads. So basically you would pay a bunch of money to a guy who worked for the Americans to put you on a boat and send you across to go build railroads, hoping for a better life. Problems, though. The amount to get across on a boat was like 10 times the amount the passage would be for anybody else. For an Irish person, at the time considered the lowest form because of the Irish potato famine and the Civil War, an Irishman was actually considered less than a black man in a lot of states, especially on the railroads. A black man actually in a lot of cases made more than an Irishman. So what happened is that an Irish person to go across to China, let's just say it would cost $20. For a Chinese person to go from China to America, it would cost $200. We literally took the ships that we were using to transport the slaves from Africa and the Caribbean and the Asian people. Because again, Americans have no off switch. And then on top of this, when you got off the boat, you then got to go to the same company that made you move for a railroad. You could not leave this company, which means you could not leave the railroad, and all of your finances went through that company. So it was very possible for Chinese people to never see an actual cent of the money they earned. They also earned criminally low amounts. I'm talking that if a black person on the railroads made, let's just say 25 cents a day, a Chinese person would make maybe 7 cents a day. And all of it would go to the company. So imagine what's going to happen. This is essentially pseudo-slavery. The other thing, too, is that the Chinese people often got paid in company script. Now, company script is basically a little piece of paper that you can use at the company store where they can regulate everything you can buy. But company script isn't paid to the company that brought you over. It's just money for you to spend. You can't give it to this guy that basically your sponsor to get you over here. You have to use that in the company store. So what happens? The sponsors aren't getting their money, so they come and basically break your legs or kill you because you're not paying out. Then you say, well, it's not my fault, my work boss isn't paying me the funds. So these companies will then go to the businesses and say, we need you to be able to transfer company. Like, you give them the company script, but you give us the pay we get you to get them over here. And basically, this is how these companies work together to make sure that they would have a consistent supply of Chinese people coming in, while also alternatively not having to actually pay them anything. It's a slavery system just moved west. The other big thing that came about, too, was that the definition Chinese people, which at the time was, and forgive me for this, but, quote, Chinamen, they weren't always Chinese. Sometimes those companies that were supplying Chinese people over to America for these companies really didn't have enough Chinese people to make the ratios or the quotas for these companies, so what they decided to do was essentially slavery. They would go to places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, certain parts of Asia, certain parts of Nepal, even some parts of rural Japanese and the Pacific Islands, and essentially take anybody. And then just call them Chinese, and no one really cared because we're just trying to get books. They're essentially just chattel. We know this because of DNA records. There's a lot of people that have roots back to their parents came over from China that actually they're not fully Chinese. There's a lot of other intermixing in there in the early generations. So, yes, Americans were essentially perpetuating a Pacific slave trade. Yeah. I apologize. This only gets dark. As one of my favorite sayings goes, but wait, it gets worse. So that is... On the American railroads, by the way, it was totally possible for people to be docked a full day's pay for, obviously, like, if you passed out from exhaustion, dock that guy a whole day's pay for sleeping on the job. Perfectly acceptable. Whippings were basically if you ever watch Hell on Wheels, they do a really good job of depicting the harsh conditions that Chinese people went through within the reasons of television. They were always a lot worse. There was also a fair degree of the Chinese trying to make money. Chinese people might get their whole families over at the increased price. The father and son work on the railroads, and the mothers and daughters would essentially work in what are known as pleasure houses. These are actually opium dens, but of course, in the American Wild West, it's not long before opium dens become brothels. And that's how they would also make money, because at least if the man from the railroad are having sex with you, you're getting their money straight. One of the big things about this is because the Chinese people were able to commit to this, they charge lower rates to get more people in the door, because the idea was, you get lower rates, you can outdo. This would lead to actual brothels in the Wild West to burn down pleasure houses, oftentimes with the people inside them, to basically cut out competition. Yeah, it also led to a lot of drug abuse in the Asiatic people because, you go to smoke opium at the end of the day to soothe your sore muscles, and of course someone throws a Molotov through the house and you're so amped out of your mind that you don't get out in time, and the whole place goes up like a kitchen fire. So yeah. And by the way, the U.S. Marshals who were in charge of controlling these railroad towns, while they did have control for what are known as freedmen or former slaves, and they did have control for African Americans, and they did have control for the white people, they basically had no rules for Chinese people. In essence, you could shoot a Chinese man as long as you paid the cost of him. So now we're going to move into the 1880s, and this is at the height of the Asian, mass Chinese and the railroad trade. So, this is also where, in history, mixed-race couples are starting to prop up. There was very often in these railroad towns, very few amounts of people. So, freedmen would marry prostitutes, or you'd have cultural mixing, Native Americans who were destroyed from the Union expansion and the Trail of Tears, of course, would stop off in these railroad towns, convert to Christianity, and take up husbands or take up wives. One of the big things that the Asian demographics had is that they were not allowed to even be seen. This is one of the things why Asians had brothels, is that they could only visit Asian businesses and they were kept outside of town. There was extreme laws put into place to prevent Asians from having children. Again, this is essentially the new form of slavery, why I call it pseudo-slavery. In 1880s, a lot of these laws were passed. Now, these laws officially were never destroyed. These laws pretty much stopped existing when the railroad town stopped existing. That was pretty much it. But this is also what led a lot of Asian people to adopt isolative mindsets. Because you've lived your entire life only being allowed to be near Asian people for a very long time, and pretty much persisted all the way out through the years, there really wasn't a time where interracial couples did make up at least 1% to 2% of American unions. Asians, it was totally different. I mean, Asian man could literally be shot if he was seen, looking at a white woman or even visiting certain brothels. So this is one of the things that pushes a lot to the cultural isolation of Asian people and Asian communities. A lot of this is because of the railroads, and we really start seeing this trend pop up in the 1880s. Moving out of the 1890s, we're going to go into 1902. So turn of the century, the 1900s. This is the start of the Philippine American War. After Spain, which had been a lot of these imperial powers had started being seceding from their actual territories, Spain's empire was collapsing, no longer needed to operate, so Spain started downsizing. Now, one of the things that America was still launching wars into the Pacific, these are known as the Interim Wars, and this is about the time that bolt-action rifles are fading in, and so are machine guns. This will be important in a second. So basically, Spain secedes the Philippines, and the Spain has a really cool deal that it does with a lot of its countries it's seceding from. Essentially, allied with Spain, still do trade deals, still negotiations. Spain will offer them funding to get a government up and running, and to establish a port of trade. And if the country becomes attacked by any other nation, Spain will step in for military support. It's a really good deal, and it actually keeps a lot of negotiations and relations with the Spanish Empire in good standing. If you're going to give a country independence, but you still want to be friends with them for trade reasons, it's a good way to do that. Like, we're stepping back, we're letting you take the reins. Here's if you need us, call us. All things considered at this time frame for imperialism, this is actually really, really progressive. However, as soon as it retracts its space from the Philippines, a Filipino-backed government says they want Spain. They will maintain Catholicism and they will maintain trade relations with Spain, but they will also no longer be allied with Spain anyway. So basically, no, we really don't like the CIA attitude of going into countries and controlling them through puppet states is nothing new. This is literally America's modus operandi through most of its imperialism. So what happens is, as soon as Spain secedes the Philippines from the South Pacific as a show of peace with America after the Spanish American War, America basically literally just walks in and says, yeah, this is ours now. And they actually cause a three-way split. The three-way split is, we're going to call them the American-backed government, the Filipino government, the People's Independent Party, or essentially the Philippines is its own independent state now, fuck you party, and then the essentially people who don't want any type of Western influence into their country. They want to go back to the way things used to be and their natural habitat. They want pro-independence. And these are typically Filipino natives. So what this causes is the Philippine American War, where it's just fought mostly by what are called the Moro fighters. Real quick, for the Moro people and the Moro fighters, they are really badass. And if you ever want to learn about a really, really cool culture and warrior group that does not get enough notice, go Google the Moro fighters of the Philippines. They are really cool, and they're really, really tough dudes. Like, they put up a fight. But anyway, digressing back to topic. So in 1902, the American-backed government starts moving in and start controlling things, and of course the two other parties, or the anti-government party, starts basically running loose. The Filipino government does not call America for help. America just steps in, again, with its gunboat policy. And as they step in, essentially, the Americans ask the government to tell them more about the Moro fighters. And there's a saying that Moro fighters are born with a bolo knife in their hand because they are such effective knife fighters. But in reality, a Moro tribesman can start their training to be a fighter at age 10. What happens is the Americans eventually go into villages and kill anybody who isn't 10 years of age or older. They just line them up in rows and shoot them with a machine gun. This is also where the Americans get really into the cult of the machine gun. And this starts many massacres. These American Marines did not, and the Colonel Wood, did not check if these people were actually Moro fighters. They just walked into villages and went, yeah, that kid's 10, bring him out here, shoot him. And kids who were less than 10 essentially were castrated in a lot of cases to prevent them having more children. I'd like to establish all right now that this next part gets pretty dark, and if you want to skip over this, it's only going to be about 5 minutes, but I think it needs to be said. So, content warning going forward. Americans do nothing but commit war crimes this entire time. There is mass graves, there are rapes almost constantly. Essentially, a scorched earth policy gets instigated, where they literally salt the earth, burn things. It basically makes Sherman's March to the Sea look like child's play. And this is perpetuated as a standard. This is not a unique group. This is very much what Wood orders everyone to do. Eventually, after the Moro fighters start hiding their children in the missionaries, the missions start essentially getting raided by American troops. And eventually, it just turns into any person becomes a target. There is mass massacres of many villages. Any village that is against the government outright just gets completely slaughtered to the last man. And that's men, women, and children. Also, another thing, too, everybody knows about the myth of Asian men have small penises joke. It's pretty common. Everybody knows about it. That term actually comes from the American-Filipino War in 1902, as far as my research goes. And what happened was Confederates, to, again, prove their kills, in these wars, they cut off the Moro fighters' genitals. And that's where the small Asian penis myth actually originated from. So when you make jokes about Asians having small penises, you are literally making fun of desecration of corpses and the genital mutilation of perfectly reasonable and peaceful island natives that the Americans just butchered. I'll let that sink in for a bit. Moving forward, we're going to go to 1914 and the start of World War I. Japan obviously is contracted by the American government to patrol shipping lanes in the South Pacific to prevent allies of Germany from getting supplies and nutrients and what have you. It pretty much, this is officially it's 1916, 1915 that this agreement goes into power, when America's still producing troops and stuff. It's not actually until late 1916, early 1917 that Americans get the Zimmerman telegram and they actually consider engaging in the war. That being said, though, anybody who has a brain knows that the Germans probably didn't have a lot of allies in the Pacific, and they also probably didn't have a lot of supplies moving through the Pacific. But this essentially gave Japan the go-ahead to commit to a lot of imperialism, when they had been already operating for a long time. And this causes a lot of pushes in Manchuria and a lot of the map of the South Pacific for World War II to come into form. It also allows Japan to get onto the League of Nations, which had been theorized early as 1916. When the war was over, there was going to have to be a council of nations that come together to solve problems. And in 1916, America knew if they handed Japan a huge amount of control of the South Pacific, they could control a lot of votes, and if someone didn't go their way, they could essentially throw them under the bus, or they could have the Japanese choke off lines. So again, America running its puppet state. And this is Woodrow Wilson doing this, who is a benevolent racist, the guy who actually came to tears at Birth of a Nation and called it like writing history with lightning. Woodrow Wilson was an out-and-out racist, and we'll see worse coming through. Another thing, too, is that France's empire was really starting to crumble. Any empires that were already crumbling because of World War I, or beforehand, really had their death nails in the coffins at the end of World War I. And actually, Woodrow Wilson, during the League of Nations formation, is actually met by a relatively young, short Vietnamese man by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who comes and asks America to parlay with France for him and sponsor his country to receive its independence, what essentially would be independence for Vietnam. Woodrow Wilson spat in his face, hawked up a nasty brown chaw loogie and fired it at Ho Chi Minh's face and had him dragged out of his office. And all Ho Chi Minh did was ask him for sponsorship, but the idea of helping this small Asian man was so repulsive, apparently he had to act like a complete and utter fucking buffoon. This goes on into 1919 as well, 1925. Essentially, Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam and starts the Communist Party, which he was already kind of in the Communist Party, but really starts to dial up and prepare for war with France. The idea that the Vietnamese War only lasted from 1963 until 1975 is actually crap. The Vietnamese were fighting the Vietnam Americans. This also goes towards the Tonkin Gall incident. So Japan is doing a lot of its imperializing in the 1920s, 1930s. They're still running high on the hog, but now they've kind of severed ties with America from the League of Nations. Again, their relationship was never an allyship. Their relationship was mostly business. And what happens is a war in Tonkin Gall. Now, Tonkin Gall happens shortly after World War I, and is basically an onset from the Tsaritsyn and the Red Army. Tonkin Gall is essentially Japan expanding into Russia, Russia's Trans-Siberian Railroad reaching them, and a big battle ensues. Russia parlays with America to work with the Japanese to try and find a peace treaty. Japan also offers the Americans to be a parlay system. So basically, both countries went to America and were like, hey, America, you've tried to kill us both to equal degrees. Would you mind being our third-party representative for peace negotiations? And, of course, America did what it does best and said, peace, it's kind of a foreign word for us, so we're just not going to help you out. You guys are on your own. We're going into isolationism. We're having this, stock problem real quick. You guys figure it out. But then America proceeded to sell both sides weapons. The Russians would receive Mark V and Mark VI British tanks and ammunition supplies. Currently at start, 30,000 Mosin Nagant rifles. It would climb later on, all the way up to the Japanese receiving Madsen machine guns and proprietary parts for their Arasakas. So there was American-made Arasakas. These Madsen machine guns will be reversed by the Japanese to make the Type 2095 light machine gun that would harrow troops in the South Pacific. Also, this is because Woodrow Wilson hated communists. For really no reason, he just didn't like communists. He's racist. Also, we go to 1919 to 1923 with the Russian troops returning home. After the wars, 1916, of course, Russia leaves World War I. Tsar Nicholas and the Tsars are attacked, and the Red Army goes to war with the White Army. Now, the Red Army was the Bolsheviks. They were the People's Army, led by General Brusilov and, of course, Comrade Joseph Stalin, Comrade Secretary, Vladimir Lenin, and Trotsky. So they start attacking the Tsar's army, and they are the Red Army. The Tsar's army is the White Army, or the King's Army. America sends more Mosin Nagants, or Nagant rifles to the Russians. In effect, total between Tonkin-Gall and what I'm going to call the Russian Revolution, specifically Tsaritsyn was the start of it, but that's a little earlier. We basically manufacture 30,000 Mosin Nagant rifles that we never actually got paid for. And I'm fully in favor of us not getting paid for that because it was basically just war profiteering. We also spent all this money to give the Russians the weapons, the White Army. We were very much entrenched with keeping Tsar Nicholas in power because Bolsheviks. Even though Tsar Nicholas really didn't like Americans all that much, we were pretty much just hedging our bets. Of course, when the Tsars falls and the Red Army stands, this is one of the start of the negotiations that will eventually lead to the Cold War and problems with Russia. It's also argued that Americans' influence in these cases, along with the British influence, is what made the Russian Revolution so bloody, and that it probably could have been handled naturally through ideology and a collapsing power structure of the Tsars, but I'm not a political theorist, so I'm not going to debate that. Then, of course, we go into the 1940s with Japan attacking America, which, again, if you've learned anything about Americans during this, it really shouldn't have been surprising that America, a nation in decline, Japan, a nation that's been on the rise through American backing for so long, now is eventually going to attack them. And, of course, but what's really actually a point is that during the wars in the South Pacific, to reclaim all the land we basically handed to the Japanese, we employ several tactics that are war crimes against not only the Japanese, but of people we think are actually allied with the Japanese. So the Doolittle Raid, where basically after Pearl Harbor, we flew a bunch of B-17s out into the middle of the ocean, launched from an aircraft carrier. They were to bomb the main island of Japan and crash into China. They were basically running on fumes and had almost no weight besides what they absolutely needed. That being said, using a non-allied party or a non-wartime party to hide your troops after basically attacking an enemy installation is taking human shields. Illegal, by all accounts. Of course, there's the Rape of Nanking that we also sponsored. I will not go into the Rape of Nanking, because I guarantee you the Rape of Nanking will definitely get this channel shut down if I go into it. There's better videos for that, but keep in mind we helped that too. Also, Americans utilized incendiaries. Now, this isn't just flamethrowers and flamethrowing tanks. This is incendiary shotgun shells, which was... Actually, they were called starburst shotgun shells, and were essentially flares you'd fire out of your shotgun, and they would pop, and they would come down. They were basically for lighting up dark areas. We would instead use these inactual shells to shoot at people to light the jungles on fire. We would use a proto-form of napalm, and we would use firebomb grenades. And at one point in time, we tried to get a bunch of bats to fly across the ocean to Japan to light their structures on fire. Yeah, we actually put incendiary bombs inside a bunch of bats and tried to release them to Japan. It's a thing. They made a little kids book series about it. I shit you not. Keep in mind, though, incendiary weapons were outlawed by not the Geneva Convention, but essentially the War Council's Commission from the Treaty of Versailles. So Americans were specifically told not to use these things, and we just didn't care because our comment was, well, the Japanese are just as bad. Despite the fact that, that's not an excuse to literally light people on fire. But, hey, they're the enemy, right? So, yes, Americans use incendiaries. Now, Americans actually still have incendiary troops. Despite the fact that we didn't technically sign that part of the Geneva Convention, Americans still keep and maintain incendiary weapons. Not only bombs, but also a flamethrowing battalion. Now, granted, the flamethrowing battalion hasn't put any more troops into it, and it basically doesn't exist except outside of paper. But the Americans did not disavow their flamethrower battalion. They're just waiting for all the people that were in the battalion to die. So think about that. Also in 1950s and 1945, we dropped 2 nuclear weapons on the Japanese. Now, I'm going to be very controversial real quick. I know for a fact through the Freedom of Information Act that the projections for the Japanese were starving. There was very little support for a Japanese standoff against the Americans. Many of the troops had already been killed, and so they were basically relying upon businessmen and everyday workers to fight. They did not have the capacity to make proper weapons. In fact, a lot of the Japanese plans for the home island invasion was to use single-shot rifles made in like bicycle shops and cheap machine shops. I mean something that literally just looks like a rifle a kid drew, like no stock. The hand grip is a piece of wood. It doesn't have sights. It's just you shoot, open it up, put a bullet in, close it, shoot, open a bullet up. It's really, really Saturday Night Special rudimentary stuff. I don't think a home island invasion would have been as bad as they predicted, where the predictions were that there would be 10 years added to the war, we have to fight every inch, Klaus clearing, we might as well just drop them. I think the bombs were basically, that was played up to use the bombs as an excuse to see what they would work like, purely for a science experiment. That's an arguable point for the first bomb. The second bomb was definitely used as a science experiment, because there's no other reason why you would drop a second bomb. But yeah, Japan got nuked twice, and considering how devastating a nuke... Yeah, it's... also, by the way, American gunships were actively firing upon merchant navy, another war crime. So this goes into a long way, but essentially, if you found a merchant navy ship, you weren't allowed to shoot upon it unless you knew for a fact it was military. Well, the Americans really didn't care. There was various stories of planes just firing at merchant navy ships for the sheer sake of, well, it's got a Japanese flag on it, so it must be supplying the navy. Come to find out, there's a few reports of ships operating in the Pacific Theater that were still doing trade negotiations that were only flying Japanese flags to get past Japanese patrols. So essentially, and they also had American flags to fly American flags or their native flags when they got past patrols. So there's a good chance that Americans did actually fire upon merchant people and just didn't bother to double check because, again, hey, fuck you, it's the enemy. Moving into the 1950s. The Korean War, obviously right fresh off the heels of World War II and being the mythology behind that, we had to go to World War Korea, where we had to stop the communist impressions. Again, go look at Korea to a modern day. We are still perpetuating that war. We refuse to lift tariffs on North Korea or even have a democratic process with them. The closest we ever got was Donald Trump, and he has about the same diplomatic skills as a wet codfish. And our sanctions are what making them starve to death, and at this point in time, it's very unlikely that North Koreans will ever truly accept or be assimilated into the People's Nation of Korea, despite the fact that most South Koreans see themselves as Koreans and that the North Koreans are just their long-lost cousins. There is a lot of unity between those people that the Americans are just kind of holding up. And the other thing, too, is that the Korean War never actually ended. It's been on standby or a stalemate for the past 70 years. Yeah, that bad. Also, Cold War starts up. Spies and international espionage against the Russian people. Into the 1950s and 1960s, of course, America starts running proxy wars and left and right, front and center against communists. Proxy wars, of course, being the most abhorrent form of war all across Asia. Too many to count, too many to list, honestly. In the 1960s and 70s, officially Vietnam gets up and started, and I want to be very clear about this. From the Freedom of Information Act, we know the Gulf of Tonkin incident didn't play out the way people think it did. The Vietnamese army did not shoot at American ships. We returned fire and they opened up again. What happened was a Vietnamese fishing boat happened to be going out to sea. Americans picked it up on their radar, fired warning shots at it. The fishers, I don't know whether they decided to fire back with their AKs or what was going on, or they decided to be violent. But instead of letting the police or letting them be detained the way we normally do, the Americans took it as a way of firing a war, and essentially the Vietnam War was started for no other reason than because we wanted one. And let me be real here. The Vietnam War was not done to prevent communism, or not done to find Russian... We didn't find Soviet interference in Vietnam, and trust me, we looked pretty fucking hard. In reality, Vietnam was started for three things. Number one, to exploit the Asiatic drug trade and the Asiatic resources of Vietnam. It's been a known fact for a long time now that the CIA was using the American Army to cover up its operations for black ops and for moving a massive amount of drugs out. Number two, it benefited the military-industrial complex, which had spropped up from the Korean War that, of course, Eisenhower warned about, and was arguably being established in World War II. And it was to remove counter-establishment people, so youthful people who were against wars after almost 2 decades of war consistently in America. They were sick and tired of racist sentiments, and of course the hippie movement and civil rights was stopping up. And Vietnam was a great way to get rid of young black people and just young people in general that are very susceptible to this, and to keep them out of politics. It was a good propaganda run for the fascist elements. And before you say anything about, well, there was a draft, it's by lottery, let's consider that the most amount of casualties we know about in Vietnam were predominantly people of color and young white people, and yet whenever we watch movies, it's always a white, well-put-together officer who's in these movies. It's never... Watch a Vietnam movie, rarely do you see people that are mixed race or black in these movies. In fact, ironically enough, Tropic Thunder, which literally has the guy who plays Iron Man, I forget his name, Robert Downey Jr., literally in blackface, probably does more for addressing the cultural diversity of the Vietnam troops than Platoon ever did. So the war starts up, of course, 1975. The civil rights era still continues, but calms down with Martin Luther King being murdered. And also, the Vietnam War comes to a close. But what this actually lends to is genocides and killing fields in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The scars still remain, plastic landmines. A lot of those were perpetuated by Americans. Some Americans, if you're watching the movie The Killing Fields, Americans were left in Cambodia in embassies. They were just left for the Khmer Rouge. No one cared about it. And the conflict probably wouldn't have rose to the point it did. Now in 1975, a big thing that happens is OPEC. This is essentially where the Saudi Arabian government starts committing to some trade tariffs on America. We get a taste of our medicine. Oil prices skyrocket, and a lot of American muscle cars, which are gas-guzzling hogs, just fail to be viable anymore. They're just too expensive to run, and with gas rationing, it's just too expensive. Also, by the way, OPEC was a complete bullshit crisis. There was plenty of gas to go around. Americans just liked screwing with people to sponsor hate and dissentment so the rich people could make a lot of money. The 25-year import was listed on cars that were outside the United States, so you had to wait 25 years to get certain import cars. That's still around to this day. And also, anti-Asian sentiment for imported cars comes about, even though these imported cars are more fuel efficient and more effective, and essentially end up destroying the automotive industry because the automotive industry refuses to try and adopt forward-thinking policies. This leads to a lot of people to burn down different plants, to attack people in their homes if they work at a foreign plant, and essentially of a black woman dressed like Rosie the Riveter going, "My name is Betty Freely, and I'm a mechanic in General Motors, and now I'm on welfare turning tricks because you bought a foreign car." And then it's like, buy American cars. Like, we literally did that. And here's the thing. OPEC was our own problem. It had nothing to do with Asian people. Asian people and Asian import cars just happened to be in the market and happened to be more reliable. And see a need, fill a need. But yet, Americans used people's hatred of them and the idea of buying American to perpetuate this. In the 1990s, however, in 2000s, there would be a surge of anime coming into America. I was a kid, I actually remember this, watching Akira on Toonami, big anime push, Dragon Ball Z came out. There a lot of Asian stuff moved onto television because the rights to these shows and stuff were very cheap. There was not a lot of cartoon stuff coming out at the time. The 80s, it kind of died off, and people wanted to get the next best thing. It also happened during the Satanic Panic, where a lot of basically right-wing Christian fundamentalist groups would essentially be using, like, oh, all these kids want Pokemon. It's this new trend. Clearly they've been taken by the devil. Pokemon is satanic. Dungeons and Dragons is satanic. Anime is satanic. Akira has all... Look at this imagery. It's all satanic. And this also perpetuates a lot of crimes against Asian people. There were fundamentalist groups that literally would go to Asian areas and tell them to get rid of all this stuff. They would go into Asian businesses and just light stuff on fire and destroy it. Not pay for it, not buy it and then go burn it. Literally go into Asian stores and just steal stuff and walk out with it. This also led to, for a long time, anime couldn't be given over to shows or TV stations to play it because they were afraid of this outburst. And then also, number two, for awards, a long time anime couldn't go into cartoon and animation awards because it was seen as degenerate. That lovely word that the Nazis like to use when they... You know the other group of people that used to call certain types of art degenerate? Yeah, they had brown shirts and jackboots. So, yes, another way that Asians were systematically attacked by Americans. Of course, the Cold War comes to an end. That doesn't stop anything. And 2010 to 2000 to 2010, China, of course, there's a lot of saber rattling with China because they became such a big power from us outsourcing all of our jobs to them and essentially them running slave operations and slave, conditions to continue their manufacturing. problems that still exist to this day. America didn't decide to try and enforce sanctions upon them or stop buying from them. They basically started saber-rattling with them, and that's always a great idea. Go to war in Asia. It worked the last 6 times we did it. And of course, the exploitation of those people. This also leads to a famous performer named Psy. So at the time, the song Gangnam Style was getting really big in America, and a lot of people were very interested in going over. Anime was kind of becoming more normalized, mainly because of the counterculture movements. But also, a lot of people liked Asian music, the Asian pop scene, Asian themes. And so what was happening is the weeaboos were kind of the initial catalyst for this, of which we'll get into them in culturally wise. But there was a lot of push, I know, in my radio station in Seattle to play Japanese music and have like a Japanese radio station and show more Japanese style of music and culture. And Psy was another big point of this. Well, unfortunately, Psy got caught that some of his earlier music was very critical of the Bush administration, and he had anti-American music because, of course, he was Korean, and the Korean people still have deep scars about the separation basically being caused by Americans. And instead of going, hey, that's a good point he makes against America, let's kind of talk about these cultural issues, instead, he was basically seen as an anti-American terrorist. A lot of stations refused to take him. He lost a lot of concert deals. We essentially canceled him, the pro-America party. And you'll notice you really can't hear Gangnam Style on the radio anymore. And you'll also notice you can't really find his stuff anymore. He just kind of disappeared off the cultural map. Funny how that works. Moving on into the 2010s and 2020s, we also have, of course, the coronavirus and the Muslim Uyghurs in China, which, even though America has done nothing about, even in fact they're basically concentration camps, because the last time America was told about concentration camps by the Polish, we did nothing then too. So it's nice to know that America really doesn't give a shit about the world if we can't make a buck. But yes, of course, Donald Trump started off with the China virus. That's actually when a lot of the big violence started happening, and it's mostly just been ignored ever since then. And going into the current day, there's more things coming up, especially with massage parlors basically being used as brothels and being extorted. Here's my thing. I have no problem with brothels. I think brothels should come back, and I think brothels under regulation could be a really big thing for a lot of problems in our society. But I want us to talk about now specifically about the recent shooting. How an angry, white, sexually frustrated, probably impotent male who was definitely had some insecurities, didn't go out and seek help, didn't go out and try to figure out what's wrong with him, didn't actually have friends that said, yes, you need to get these problems considered. Instead, he invested in a clergyman who probably told him that these feelings he's having are sins and he just needs to expel them and take care of his problems, and went in and killed these women. Most likely, if he was a regular customer, he probably had some sexual remittent feelings to them, and that was being repressed by whatever feelings he had, and so this is what happened. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't a random fluke. Angry white men going and killing minorities is a literal history of America, and it's going to continue until the system fucking ends. It's not an uptick. It's not a surge. It's really, unfortunately, business as usual in America. I don't know what else to call it. I want to finish up with some cultural things, too. Again, like I said, most people forget that Russians and Indian people are Asians. There's a systemic exploitation of Asian women in media, obviously with porn and films like Crazy Rich Asians and the Asian stereotype. But also, I want to go into now the ideas of Asian exploitation on the alt-right. So the alt-right kind of has this thing, predominantly spawned by from the YouTube series Black Pigeon Speaks, who's, a complete fat neckbeard, of course, go figure, who has moved to Japan, and he kind of spawns the idea of, we should go to Japan because Japanese women haven't been ruined by modern feminism, and of course they're all tight and submissive, and that's another byproduct of Americans' exploitation of Asian people. We don't care about Asian people having thoughts and feelings and how Japan right now is having a sexual revolution. We only care about the fact that we men, American men, want to go to other country. They have submissive women. We see women, want women, club women, take to. That is entrenched white supremacy and entrenched exploitation of Asian people. And that has happened because systemically we've always kind of had that feeling against Asian people, even as far back as the Asian brothels in the 1880s. Also, again, Indian people never being given the time of day, even though they're one of the most up-and-coming and progressive societies. India has reached its green energy goal long before they planned to. They've almost eliminated the caste system entirely. They've done a lot to raise poverty, and they've done a lot to take care of their people. But most people don't give a crap. Most people, when they think of India, they either think of Eat, Pray, Love, or they think of Slumdog Millionaire. Because, again, Americans just don't care outside of our cultural and economic needs. China, with the Uyghur population, of course, goes without saying. And all the way up into Korea, where K-pop is now a big thing. And this goes into weeaboos and otakus to start, but they're a good launching point. A lot of people think that weeaboos, like, are Asian heads. Like, we don't like Asian culture. Look at weeaboos. Weeaboos are actually a very weird form of cultural appropriation. The world of Japan that weeaboos and otakus think exists doesn't actually exist. They just take the parts of the culture they like and they to adopt another. And the idea that people are literally throwing up American culture or their American heritage to adopt a Japanese heritage after years of exploitation really lends to that sort of imperialist mindset that a lot of people have about Asians. And then again, of course, the numerous racist jokes about Asian women. In fact, another thing too is that a lot of I remember when I was growing up as a kid, a lot of women. There was a magazine that came out in my school, a beauty magazine that the Fashion and Home Ec school put on, and a lot of people kind of made a comment that the Asian students and the Asian women in these magazines looked too young to be in high school. And that's kind of another thing is that, a lot of the fashion industry doesn't produce Asian women into their magazines outside of niche groups because Asian women are kind of seen as these naturally youthful, vibrant young women, and that actually makes women, American women, very jealous and angry because they can't have that youthful demeanor. And a lot of that, again, is the American imperialist system. We're not happy that Asian people have a natural, beautiful glow or that this is how their genetics work out. We're angry at them because they have something we don't have and we can't take it from them. So that just about does it, guys. I know this was an hour, but I appreciate you. But yes, America never has been friends with Asian people. We've only ever really exploited them for a long time. And if you realize it or don't, hopefully you don't realize it. And I kind of want to go into this topic a little bit more with some of the things we brought up, but I think right now that's going to do it just because it's an hour and I don't want to take this too long. Thank you for sticking with me, and I apologize for any triggering events that have occurred here on out, but this really needs to be said. I don't know much else what to say, but I appreciate your time. I'll see you when I see you, and let's stop the hatred against Asian Americans, Asian nationals, and Pacific Islanders.